Cepher Commentaries. Today we're discussing Genesis chapter 9, Bere'shiyth 9. And Elohim blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. So let us begin with this passage here. This is a Torah command. This is as binding as anything else written. And we do see that there is, in fact, a Torah given in Genesis. It's called the Paradise Torah. And some of these commands we're going to see here. But there were commands also given to us in Genesis 1 concerning using the greater light and the lesser light and the stars also to determine the signs, the seasons, the days, and the years. This is a command. And this does not mean use the sun only to create years, months, and days, but rather you're supposed to use both the sun, the moon, and the stars to reckon your signs, your seasons, and your days and your years. And just to make a kind of a point about that, when we talk about this, the signs are going to be primarily the signs given to us in the moon. And the reason for this is because the sun does not have a waxing and waning schedule like the moon does. The sun rises and sets. We might see a partial moon in the sunrise and a partial moon in the sunset, but when the sun is in the sky, it is always a full sun. This is not the case with the moon. The moon is a recurring cycle of signs in the moon. So the signs in the moon, the otiot, that are given in Genesis 1:14, give us an indication that the moon, you are to reconcile the moon's signs as part of your strategy for determining your calendar. And the seasons, of course, are moedim is the word that is used there. And this is not only the seasons of the year, as we discussed in our discussion on Genesis 8, where we talked about the seed time, which is Zarah. We talked about the harvest time, which is Katsir. And we talked about the Feast of the Ingathering, Asif. All of these are very important to Yah when you sow and when you harvest. And these seasons are accompanied with feast days that recognize these harvest times as an agricultural calendar that is predicated, of course, and begins with the barley being in Aviv, when the barley is ripened. The barley ripens annually around the vernal equinox. And in addition to that, there is a symbology in the heavens using the stars also to show that the barley is in Aviv when Spica, the planet in the left hand of the star in the planet of the left hand of Virgo, the constellation, appears above the event horizon, which it does following the vernal equinox, again showing the barley is in Aviv and reckoning the first month of the year using the sun for the equinox and the moon, the first moon associated with the equinox, the new moon, and also the stars. All three are used to give us the first month of the year, an agricultural month that then is going to be celebrated with an initial harvest, Katsir, and the Katsir is the initial harvest of the winter barley, which had been sown earlier. The winter barley would be harvested for the Feast of Katsir, which is a wave offering where you demonstrate that your barley was in fact successful, and you wave this to the priest on the day after the first Shabbat of the counting of the Omer, that first Shabbat being contained in the Feast of Matzah. So you begin in the 14th day, on the evening of the 14th day, recognizing the Pesach and the Passover. And all of the 14th day is a day of preparation when you enter into the high Shabbat of Matzah, the Chag, and which is a high Sabbath beginning on the evening of the 15th and continuing through the day of the 15th. And this continues for a 7-day period. Inside that 7 days, there will be a regular Shabbat, which is the 7th day, called the Shabbat or Shabbat, the 7th, and in plural, Shabbat. That 7th day on a continual reckoning would be the first Shabbat of the year as a formal count. Not the first Shabbat, actually, because there have been 2 Shabbats before that, possibly 2, because Pesach falls on the 14th day of the month. But the counting of the Omer doesn't begin until you reach the Shabbat inside of Matzah. That's why it's formally called the first Shabbat. And so that Shabbat proceeds and is going to go for 7 weeks. And then the day after will be what's called Pentecost or Shavuot. We're in the middle of the counting of that Omer right now as I speak. But we can see that Katsir is the wave offering the day after that Shabbat. So technically you count 7 sevens from Katsir to Shavuot. And so here you see that Noah and his sons are given yet another instruction that is consistent with the Paradise Torah. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Now, this command is given to all of the seed of Noah, which, of course, includes all of the Ben Adam, which is to say that we are supposed to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Those who do not wish to be fruitful and do not wish to multiply, well, let them restrict themselves as they will. But to the believer is to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And this is something that you should plan for and you should plan on. And this means that you have to strategize as to how you're going to afford to pay for children. Okay. Verse 2, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every fowl of the air and upon all that moves upon the earth and upon all the fish of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Now, what is happening here is that man is being given dominion once again over all of the beasts of the earth, over all the fowl of the air, upon everything that moves upon the earth and all the fish of the sea. Man is given dominion over all of that. Now, does that mean that man can eat it all? Well, that's another discussion. All right. Every moving thing that lives shall be meat for you, even as the green herb I have given you all things. Well, now this appears to indicate that, hey, when you look at the Torah of the paradise, well, everything you can eat, everything. I've given everything, every moving thing that lives shall be meat for you. But flesh with its life, which is in its blood, you shall not eat. And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast I will require it, and the hand of man, and at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of a man. Now, this is interesting because does this mean that you shall not eat meat, but flesh, but meat with its life, which is in the blood, you shall not eat? And if you do, the blood of your lives will be required. At the hand of every beast I will require it, and at the hand of man, and at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of a man. Now, I think when you look closely at this passage, you can see that with a beast that kills another beast, then the beast is to be killed. But the man that kills another man, the man is to be killed. That's, I think, what the meaning of verse 5 is. It is not saying that, gee, if you kill a beast, then a man has to lose his life for killing a beast. In fact, verse 6 is going to clarify that. Whoso sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of Elohim he made man. Okay, here we go. And again, we're talking about this idea of the image of Yah in man. What is that image? You know, it's a very famous saying that Clint Eastwood said in one of his movies. He says, when you take a man's life, you take everything he has and everything he ever will have. It's a good point. It's a great way of reckoning it. And Elohim spoke to Noah and to his sons with him and saying, and I, behold, establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, and of every beast on the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark, to every beast of the earth, and I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood. Neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And Elohim said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and all the earth. Okay, now this is again a very significant thing that's taking place, and we have evidence that this is in fact true today because we see the rainbow in the heaven. And the rainbow is the covenant of Yah, that a sign that he between him and the earth, that he will never flood the whole earth again. Now, this word is kesheth, and in the original meaning, a bending, meaning a bending of a bow for shooting. And so, as a consequence, we see that the word for rainbow is the same word that is going to be used for a bow that's used for shooting an arrow, right? It's the same bow. And I know we had a discussion about this in the Spanish because the word was arco. And there was a little bit of upset about that. Well, you can't use arco. Well, you can because it's the same word in Hebrew, kesheth. Now, kesheth, this word comes from kasha, which means to be cruel, to be fierce, to make grievous, and to be sore, to stiffen, right? Kasha. But a kesheth is going to be a created noun from the word kasha by placing the tav at the end of the word. By placing the tav at the end of the word, we get a suffix that is going to give you the idea of the strength of a noun, kesheth, keshet. And either way, this is the bow, and this is the bow. This is why the word can be used in Revelation 6, talking about the rider with the white horse, who is also given a bow. Well, the bow can be, yes, a bow that you use to shoot arrows, but it can also be a rainbow, right? I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign for a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. Now, of course, Isaac Newton then showed that, in fact, the prism that is created with the clouds in the sky, or the precipitation in the sky, with the sun shining through at exactly 49 degrees, is where we see the rainbow. It creates a prism, and you can create this prism in your house using a crystal, using the same idea, that is to have the sunlight passing through the crystal at 49 degrees, and it creates a prism, or the prism colors of the rainbow. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between Elohim and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And Elohim said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. Now, this is an interesting thing, because when we talk about this, we're going to see that this is a sevenfold covenant. And the sevenfold covenant, Yah swearing 7 oaths, that this idea of the sevenfold covenant is given in the 7 colors of the rainbow. Now, you can imagine that when Isaac Newton took a look at this, one of the conclusions he reached was that this covenant was expressed in the idea of 7 squared. That is to say, 7 times 7 gives us the 49 degrees that is then going to refract light to create this rainbow, right? And remember, Isaac Newton was a huge student of the Hebrew Scriptures. And in fact, many people believe, and I'm one of those, that most of Isaac Newton's calculus came from munching, if you will, on the Hebrew Scriptures. For instance, when you take the 22 letters of the Hebrew language and you divide them by the sevenfold creation, the sevenfold doctrine of his whole creation, well, you end up with pi, right? 22 divided by 7. Okay, so let's continue in verse 9 as we begin to see things are going to change now that the flood has ended. And the sons of Noah who went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japhet. And Ham is the father of Canaan. These are the 3 sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. And Noah began to be a husbandman, or a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. Now, before we get to this, we kind of rushed through this verse right here. Noah began to be a husbandman and planted a vineyard. Well, do you think he got grapes that week? No, he didn't. It was probably 3 years before he got grapes that were sufficient enough for him to make wine. And then it took another year before he would have wine. So you're talking, anyway, 3 to 4 years after the flood was over, it goes by in one sentence. And Noah began to be a husbandman and he planted a vineyard. Okay. Again, this is why I'm saying that when you look at Genesis, it's very much a summary. All right. And he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brethren outside. And Shem and Japhet took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. And he said, "Cursed is Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brethren." All right. Now, this is a much more difficult proposition than what is set forth in this description. You might find it highly irrational that because Ham looked in the tent and saw Noah naked, that all of a sudden Canaan is going to be cursed. But there's much more involved in that. And I think part of the involvement that is involved in this has to do with the discussion of saw the nakedness of his father. This passage, let me see if we can dial that up in the Ivrit, and let's see what we find in here, because in the Ivrit, when you're talking about saw, saw is ra'ah. Literally, it means to advise, appear, to approve, to behold, to discern, to have experience, to gaze, to be near, to perceive, to regard. So this could be more than just ra'ah is the word, ra'ah. And then when we talk about the nakedness of the father, right, this is erva. And it literally means nudity, nakedness, shame, or uncleanness. However, this is also, sometimes this is referenced, for instance, when you talk about the transaction that took place between Reuben and his father Yaakov, when it says he went up to his father's couch. This is how it's described in 1 Chronicles 1. However, it's also described that he uncovered his father's skirt. And this, of course, is implying that, in fact, Reuben had had a relationship with Bilhah. Reuben had had a relationship with Bilhah. And as a result of this relationship with Bilhah, he lost his right as the primogenitor. It was a transgression that caused him to lose the right of the progenitor, which then went to Joseph, 1 Chronicles 5:1. So you can see that when you're talking about uncovered, he saw the nakedness of his father. This could be a way that the passage is describing in very subtle terms that, in fact, it wasn't Canaan, but rather, or it was Canaan and not Ham who had uncovered the nakedness of his father Abraham. And this could be describing Canaan having a relationship with Noah's wife, who in Jubilees is described as Imzara, meaning the mother of your seed, but whose name is described elsewhere as Naamah, and Naamah being the last descendant of Cain, the firstborn son of Adam and Hua. So when we talk about this, we talked about Lamech before, and let's deal with this issue a little bit more here. Lamech was the seventh from Cain. He was the seventh generation from Cain. His sister was Naamah. And there was an eighth generation, which was Tubal-Cain. And Tubal-Cain, according to the discussion in the book of Yashar, Tubal-Cain advised Lamech to unleash an arrow in order to kill a deer that Tubal-Cain had spotted. And Lamech did unleash the arrow. And unfortunately, it wasn't a deer, it was Cain, and he killed Cain, his great-grandfather. And he was so angry, he beat Tubal-Cain to death. And so the passage is given, I believe it's in Genesis 6, telling that he killed a man to his hurt and, and slayed another. Well, you get one cryptic phrase in Genesis that tells us nothing, but Jasher tells us the rest of the story that took place and how this would terminate the sevenfold protection on Cain. When we see the sevenfold protection on Cain, this is a protection for 7 generations. The 8th generation, Tubal Cain, is going to be the one who's going to put the end to the cover, the end to the protection of the mark of Cain itself, and Tubal Cain would be destroyed. But what of Naamah? Well, Naamah is then going to enter onto the ark with Noah. And where we see the genetic trigger is right here. Because what takes place is that Naamah was probably carrying Nephilim seed, because the children of Cain did not have any restrictions on them prior to the flood. The children of Cain were, those women, many of those women were those who transgressed with the Watchers. So again, the Watchers were in the 7th generation. And so the Watchers being in the 7th generation, we see the 7th generation of Cain being contemporaneous with the 10th generation from Adam. In other words, Noah is of the 10th generation, but Naamah and Lamech are of the 7th generation of Cain. So in this, we see that in this generation, the chances are that Naamah was carrying with her latent Nephilim seed. In other words, she may have been carrying a triple helix DNA or other kinds of DNA information that is not going to be triggered in any regular childbirth, but when the grandson gets involved in an incestuous relationship, that does in fact trigger this Nephilim seed. And as a result, Canaan's progeny from this point forward is going to be carrying a Nephilim DNA, which is how the DNA succeeded in being transmitted through the boat. So now we can see that now we know why is Canaan cursed instead of Ham. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. Now, could this also read, and Canaan, whose father was Ham, saw the nakedness of his father Noah and told his 2 brethren outside? Well, at any rate, we see that the curse comes on Canaan in verse 25, and he said, "Cursed is Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brethren." And he said, "Blessed is Yahweh Elai of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant." Now, this is going to, of course, become much more large when we see Canaan transgressing after the land grant, and Abraham going in as a stranger into a strange land, and he goes into the land of Canaan. And it is in the land of Canaan that the promised land is given, and it is in the land of Canaan that the house of Yasharel is going to occupy. Elohim shall enlarge Japhet, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. Okay, and Noach lived after the flood for 350 years, and all the days of Noach were 950 years, and he died. Again, he dies 1 year or years short of 1,000 years. Okay, all right. So with that, we can see now that we have this idea that there's going to be basically 3 intense lineages. But remember that there is mtDNA from 4 women. And I think what we're seeing here is this, is that, yes, you have the mtDNA from the wife of Japhet, the wife of Ham, and the wife of Shem. Each of those women have their own mtDNA. And it's very likely that those 3 women had mtDNA that was consistent with the Ben Adam. That is to say, it was not a polluted or corrupted DNA, which was why they were on the vessel. But with Noah coming on with Naamah, Naamah may have carried with her corrupted DNA, which was not carried through in the blessing of Shem and Japhet and Ham, but rather does not take new life except through the transgression of Canaan in this passage. And the transition of Canaan in this passage may have been what is then going to bring forward Nephilim. Now, remember in Genesis 6:4, it tells us there were Nephilim in the earth in those days and afterward. And afterward. And so I think the best way to understand this transmission is to recognize that we're talking about a genetic disposition. We're talking about specific genes coming through the flood through some kind of a latent holding. And this latent holding not being found in the Ham, not being found in Yafet, not being found in Shem, but only is being carried in Naamah. And Naamah, there's even discussion that Naamah may not have been the mother of the boys, but rather the wife that came on board with Noah and not the mother. And so her latency, her DNA carrying the Nephilim seed would not have been seen at all. In other words, Noah would not have fathered another child with Naamah after the flood. It wouldn't have happened. But the transgression is great because Canaan was able to father children after that through Naamah. And again, these children are not given to us in a list, but we see that there's going to be children of Canaan, and these children of Canaan are going to be carried through with a Nephilim seed from which many of the giants are going to proceed after this. And we're going to see this even when we get into the book of Numbers, where we deal with the sons of Anak, not Enoch, but the sons of Anak. Okay, and so this gives us a very detailed and difficult history of this issue with Noah and his sons. Now, one thing I want to mention here, too, when we talk about finishing up Genesis 9, is that Genesis 9 now is going to essentially wrap up the creation narrative, because at this point, we have gotten to the end of the flood, and Genesis 10 is going to begin with, these are the generations of the sons of Noah. So we're going to begin into what's called the Toldot section of Scripture. And the Toldot section of Scripture is going to be distinguishable from the creation narrative. The creation narrative is something to which Moses was not an eyewitness. And in fact, there are many people who believe that the narrative, the creation narrative, was given through word of mouth as essentially legend that was crafted in structuring this lineage of Adam and Hua. The creation narrative, of course, has breadth in so many different commentaries, but we see in the scriptures that we have this creation narrative that's going to be recorded not only in the book of Genesis, but also in the book of Jubilees and also in the book of Jasher, that are going to reiterate a very similar creation narrative before we get to discussing the generations of Noah. And bear in mind that when you accept the testimony that all life on earth was destroyed except for that life that was contained, all life that had breath on earth was destroyed except that which was contained in the ark, and Noah and his sons and their wives were the foundation of all modernity. All modernity stems from this. So we have this kind of drawing line, if you will, that the drawing line is creation until the deluge, and then all modernity comes from the generations of Noah. The Toldot of Noah is going to be the beginning of modernity. And so we have to distinguish between this earlier narrative and the post narrative, right? Okay, all right. Well, that concludes our discussion of Genesis chapter 9, and we will begin tomorrow with Genesis chapter 10.